Thank you, Koki. That was just delightful. I'm sure we all enjoyed that so much. I'm looking forward to going back at the back table. Koki is going to be signing some books for you after we do Q&A here and after our next keynote speaker. So just so you know, if you're looking to get one of Koki's books signed by Koki, after the next speaker and the Q&A, that's when you need to quietly head to the back and get those books, which I know I'm going to be doing. So our next speaker is Valerie Boyd, and she is the author of the award-winning biography, Wrapped in Rainbows, The Life of Neale Hurston. Zora. Yes, exactly. I'm sorry, I need my glasses up here. Ms. Boyd is the former arts editor at the Atlantic Journal-Constitution and has written extensively on race, arts, and culture for numerous national publications, including the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Paste, Ms., Essence, and Atlanta Magazine. She's an associate professor at the University of Georgia's Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication, where she serves as the Charlene Hunter Galt Distinguished Writer in Residence and teaches arts journalism and narrative nonfiction. Please welcome Valerie Boyd.
Good afternoon. It's great to see all of you here. Thank you for that warm introduction, Dr. Healy. Seems like some of you are Zora fans. When Dr. Healy said the tongue-twisting name, you all were like, Zora, Zora, that's great. I want to thank the Pioneer Institute for inviting me to participate in today's program. And of course, I'm honored to share the podium with the legendary journalist, Koki Roberts. And I'm happy to be here today with all of you. So I'd like to share the story of how I came to write Wrapped in Rainbows, The Life of Zora Neale Hurston. And then later, of course, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about my journey and also about Hurston and her work. In Fort Pierce, Florida, 2 stocky evergreens guard the grave of Zora Neale Hurston. As a warm January breeze blows across the nearly barren burial ground, the trees gallantly bow to greet me. I have come to this cemetery at the dead end of North 17th Street to ask the novelist and anthropologist for her permission to write a book about her life. From what I understand, Zora was that kind of woman, the kind you had to ask before you acted on her behalf, the kind you couldn't be too presumptuous about. Still, despite a healthy respect for my ancestors, I am not in the habit of talking to the dead. But something about Zora remains vibrantly alive, and that living spirit has called me here on this day, some 40 years after her death. A woman of enormous talent and remarkable drive, Zora Neale Hurston was the most successful, most prolific, and most significant Black woman writer of the first half of the 20th century. Over a career that spanned more than 30 years, she became, as many of you know, an outstanding novelist, respected anthropologist, journalist, critic, and playwright, publishing 4 novels, 2 books of folklore, an autobiography, numerous short stories, and dozens of articles and plays. Let me just take a minute and say this is the 1930s and 40s. This was a Black woman whose grandparents were slaves. So the fact that she published 7 books in her lifetime is really, really remarkable. Now, although Hurston managed to become a somewhat popular author in her own lifetime, her greatest acclaim has come posthumously. During the past 30 years, with the reissue of all her major published works, Hurston has come into her own as an essential part of the American literary canon and as an important part of the popular culture. Many Black women writers, and increasingly writers of all colors and cultures, cite Hurston as a literary foremother. Their Eyes Were Watching God, her proto-feminist tale of a Black woman's quest for independence, is widely regarded as a masterpiece. Alice Walker has said of the novel, "There is no book more important to me than this one." Oprah Winfrey has called Their Eyes Were Watching God her favorite love story of all time. And Toni Morrison has called Hurston one of the greatest writers of our time. In her writing and in her style, Hurston was far ahead of her own time, though she sometimes sought to make time stand still where her age was concerned. Born in 1891, Zora lopped a whole decade off her age and shaved off a few more years here and there whenever she saw fit. In 1917, for instance, she entered Knight High School in Baltimore after several years of what she called wandering. She vaguely described it as wandering in her autobiography. In fact, what happened was that Hurston disappeared from the public record when she was about 14 or 15 years old. And I've searched, hospital records, church records, all kinds of records, trying to find her during these 10 years and couldn't find anything. Marriage records, everything. But she reemerged on the public record about 10 years later when she was 26 years old and still hadn't finished high school. So embarrassed to be a 26-year-old high school student and needing to present herself as a teenager to qualify for free public schooling in the state of Maryland, she gave her age as 16 and the year of her birth as 1901, confounding Hurston scholars for generations to come. And of course, once she lopped those 10 years off, she never added them back on. In 1939, in fact, the 48-year-old writer briefly married a 23-year-old man. For the marriage certificate, she gave her age as 29. Apparently, she had the looks to pull it off. She also had a fiery intellect, an infectious sense of humor, and the gift, as one friend put it, of walking into hearts. Hurston used these talents and dozens more to elbow her way into the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, befriending such luminaries as poet Langston Hughes and popular singer-actress Ethel Waters. Though Hurston didn't drink, fellow writer Sterling Brown recalled, when Zora was there, she was the party. Another friend remembered Hurston's apartment, furnished by donations she solicited from friends, as a spirited open house for artists. All this socializing didn't keep Hurston from her work, though. She would sometimes write in her bedroom, friends recalled, while the party went on in the living room. By 1935, Hurston had published several short stories and articles, as well as her first novel, Jonah's Gourd-Vine, and a well-received collection of folklore called Mules and Men. But the late 1930s and the early 1940s marked the real zenith of her career. She published Their Eyes Were Watching God in 1937, Tell My Horse, her study of Caribbean voodoo practices, in 1938, and another masterful novel, Moses, Man of the Mountain, in 1939. But it wasn't until her autobiography, her dubious autobiography, I should say, Dust Tracks on a Road, was published in 1942, that Hurston received the well-earned acclaim that had long eluded her. That year, she was profiled in Who's Who in America, Current Biography, and 20th Century Authors. Still, she never received the financial rewards she deserved. The largest publisher's advance Hurston ever received was $500, which is equivalent to about $5,000 in today's money. And the biggest royalty she ever earned from any of her books was $943.75. So when Hurston died in 1960, at age 69, having distanced herself from family and old friends, Fort Pierce, Florida residents had to take up a collection for her funeral. It didn't yield enough for a tombstone, though, so she was buried in a grave that remained unmarked until 1973. That summer, Alice Walker, then a 29-year-old literary upstart herself, placed a headstone on the grave proclaiming Zora Neale Hurston a genius of the South. And this was an act of reclamation that helped to jumpstart the ongoing Hurston revival. Zora Neale Hurston died 3 years before I was born. Yet when I read Their Eyes Were Watching God in 1981, I felt that I had found a kindred spirit, a literary grandmother of sorts. The story of Janie Crawford embarking on a journey to know herself, similar to the journey I was embarking on as a 17-year-old college student, was mesmerizing to me. And I was absolutely amazed that someone could have written a book in the 1930s. And she wrote this book in 7 weeks, by the way. But I was amazed that somebody could have written a book in the 30s that still spoke to me so resonantly, so urgently across the decades. Who was the woman behind this book, I wanted to know. How did she do this? So I read everything I could find by and about Zora Neale Hurston, including Robert Hemingway's excellent 1977 Hurston biography. I became a full-fledged Zora enthusiast, and I had all the books, all the Zora t-shirts, all the Zora coffee mugs, and all the other, swag to prove it. I also became a writer, editor, and book critic, with a particular passion for Black literature and for documenting Black lives. In 1989, I led a carpool of Zorophiles, or Zora heads as I call us, from Atlanta, where I live, to the legendary Eatonville, Florida, the all-Black town just outside Orlando, where Hurston grew up. We went there to attend the first Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts and Humanities. The annual festival has grown tremendously since 1989. At that first festival, there were maybe 200 people attending. This year, the 25th anniversary festival, the crowd was estimated at 150,000. But that first festival was magic. Attendance was so small, you could look clear across the dusty fields of Eatonville and see your friends buying fried fish from the Ladies of Macedonia Baptist Church. And you could feel Zora's presence almost tangibly. In fact, a huge bird hovered over that first festival so persistently that everyone started calling it Zora. That lone bird was a black crow, a type of vulture, which bothered me at the time. I didn't know then that those birds of prey are considered sacred in many African countries because they can eat death and not die, which, when you consider her legacy, is exactly what Zora Neale Hurston did. A few years after that inaugural Hurston Festival at the 1994 event, and I started going back every year, that's how magical that first festival was. So at the 1994 festival, another magical thing happened. There, Bob Hemingway, author of that first Hurston biography, gave a talk in which he candidly critiqued his own book, pointing out things that he felt he'd missed because he was a man writing about a woman, because he was a white American writing about an African American. And then he made this bold statement. He said, "It's time for a new biography to be written, and it needs to be written by a Black woman." Well, I wanted to just raise my hand at that point. I knew, with what Toni Morrison calls a knowing so deep, that I was the one who would answer that call. I felt it internally. But I was afraid. I was daunted by the idea of writing a biography, my first book, on a figure as important and elusive as Zora Neale Hurston. So I don't know what you do when you're afraid, but I tend to do nothing. So I put the idea on the back burner, telling myself maybe in 10 years I'll be ready to do that. Well, it seems that Zora had a shorter timetable in mind. About a year and a half later, completely out of the blue, I received a phone call from a New York literary agent who was looking for someone to write a biography of Zora Neale Hurston. He said he'd gotten my name from someone he'd met at a party. That's typical Zora, a party, right? This felt to me like more than a coincidence. It was almost as if Zora herself were calling. And I felt that my only choice, my only answer was yes. So as I began to embrace the auspicious responsibility of researching and writing her life, I decided to make a pilgrimage to Zora's grave to ask for her permission, for her blessings to tell the story. A no-nonsense kind of New York guy, my literary agent was all skepticism. "Do you really expect her to answer?" he asked, no doubt imagining me holding a seance in the graveyard. I had no intention of doing anything that spooky, but somehow I felt that if I asked, I would be given an answer. I took Zora some Florida oranges, which she loved, and a small wad of money, because she never had enough in her lifetime. And I also took her some Pall Malls, because that's what she smoked. After I'd offered these gifts to Zora and mumbled a few words, I kid you not, I looked up and saw a big dark bird, a lone black crow, circling the cemetery. I took that as a sign that I received Zora's blessings. Those blessings, I feel, followed me throughout my 6-year journey to research and articulate Hurston's life. And it was a remarkable journey, one that took me to Eatonville several times and to many other towns in Zora's beloved Florida. In Tallahassee and Jacksonville, for instance, I pored over old newspapers and risked my eyesight scanning countless sheets of microfiche. In Gainesville, I combed through the University of Florida's priceless Hurston collection, which includes all the papers in Zora's possession at the time of her death. Searching through these thoughtful letters, overdue bills, and unfinished manuscript pages, I delicately handled their charred edges, giving thanks for the attentive sheriff's deputy who rescued them from a fire. The blaze was set a few days after Zora's death by a cleanup crew, unaware, of course, that they were burning up history. Like a detective, I sought to follow every clue and to interview every witness to Zora's extraordinary life. This pursuit led me to visit previously unknown nooks and crannies all over the South, from Notasulga, Alabama, the small town where she was born, to Fort Pierce, Florida, where I interviewed a dozen people who remembered Zora's final years there. In more known environs, like New York City, I spoke with historian John Henrik Clark and political activist and Zora nemesis Louise Thompson Patterson. Though in their 90s at the time of the interviews, they both recalled Zora's lively years in New York in the 1930s and 40s, at the height of her career. Dr. Clark talked about the famous feud between Hurston and Langston Hughes over the play they worked on together called Mulebone. Though it's true that the dispute put an end to their closeness, he told me, they still liked to laugh together, as he put it. Louise Thompson Patterson, who was at the center of that 1931 Mulebone dispute, was 96 years old and living in a nursing home in Harlem when I met her, and she was still mad at Zora. At one point, after I'd been pressing her fragile memory for details, she turned to me and said, "All I remember about Zora is that she was crazy." So that dispute continued on. In Durham, North Carolina, a half dozen stately black men and women, now in their 80s, took me back to 1939. That year, they were all fresh-faced students at North Carolina College for Negroes, now North Carolina Central University, where Zora was teaching at the time and gleefully breaking the strict rules set by the school's president. When I asked the students, the former students now in their 80s, why Hurston only taught there for 1 year, several of them concurred that it was because she was dating a student. When I asked if anyone remembered the student's name, one man whipped out a 1939 yearbook and pointed to a handsome, clean-shaven fellow, and he said it was John Ellis. This is him. It was John Ellis right here. Of course, I tried to find Mr. Ellis, but he was no longer around to confirm or deny. One of those former students I interviewed in Durham was Alex Rivera, who was then a 90-year-old man who graciously offered me a picture of Zora that he snapped at a 1939 football game. "Would you like a copy?" he asked casually. "You can have it." The moment I saw it, I knew I wanted the photograph to be on the cover of my book, which it now is. Nearly as valuable as the generous people I met while working on the book were the various libraries and archives I visited. I have fond memories of long hours spent hunkering down in the corridors of the vast Library of Congress, which houses many of Hurston's anthropological papers. I spent no less time in the musty basement of the archives at Barnard College and at DC's Howard University, where Hurston attended school before going on to Barnard. And the Beinecke Library at Yale is home to many of her original manuscripts, including the handwritten pages of Their Eyes Were Watching God. Seduced by Zora's rounded, slanting handwriting, I spent nearly a month in New Haven, living in one of the town's oldest and least expensive hotels, in a small room with a mini refrigerator, brown shag carpet, and 2 narrow twin beds. One of these beds served as a makeshift desk for my laptop, where I recorded my impressions of all the treasures I was unearthing on what sometimes seemed to be a charmed journey. Once I'd accumulated a critical mass of material, I felt ready to write, which proved to be a whole other adventure. Though I have a nice, comfortable office in my home in Atlanta, I found it physically impossible to write there. It seemed that I suddenly had so many friends I needed to meet for lunch, so much laundry to do, anything except facing that blank page. After months of procrastinating, I realized that the only solution was to place myself in an environment where I had almost literally nothing else to do but write. Like Zora, I became a road warrior on a restless search for the perfect solitude to coax the words out of me. Also, like Zora, I felt drawn to Florida, where she wrote 5 of her 7 published books. On the west coast of that southernmost state, I found a 1-bedroom condo in Sarasota, a city known for its support of the arts and its large community of fairly affluent retirees. It was off-season. That was the only way I could afford to be there. And it was the perfect place. I knew no one there, and at times I felt like I was the only person of color and the only person of under 65 in the whole city. So I had few distractions, but after a couple of months there, the seniors in the retirement community where I live got to know me. So if they saw me dawdling in the bookstore in the middle of the day, they'd say, "What are you doing? How many pages have you written today? You need to get back to work." So with the Gulf of Mexico shimmering at my doorstep, I began to write in earnest, settling into a comfortable and productive routine. I woke up every morning around 6:30, showered, meditated, and turned on my computer by 9 a.m. Save for a short lunch break, I sat there for 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, crafting letters into words, words into sentences, and sentences into a narrative. My reward for a good day's work was to take a walk on the beach to watch the sunset, which was always different, always uplifting, always spectacular. Or as Zora, another sunset watcher, once put it, the show is changed every day, but every performance is superb. I finished Wrapped in Rainbows, The Life of Zora Neale Hurston in Sarasota in early September 2001. One day when I was working on the final chapter, I heard a noisy bird cawing just outside my front door, a place where I'd never seen a bird land. The noise was so loud, so insistent, that I was afraid to open my door lest the bird fly into my living room. As if sensing my hesitation, it softened its cry and moved a few doors down. Finally, I poked my head out for a peek. My visitor was a large black crow, just like the one we nicknamed Zora more than a decade ago. Somehow, I wasn't surprised. "Hey, Zora," I said. "I'm almost finished." I closed the door, returned to my work, and smiled as she flew away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Now we're all Zora heads, right? This is fantastic. We're going to have a quick Q&A right now, which will be facilitated. And maybe if we could get Valerie to come back up and Koki to come back up for a second and answer some questions. Thanks.
Wait 1 minute, I have a mic. Valerie,
Yes.
what effect did Zora have on later black writers that we might know?
Hurston was definitely very influential on pretty much every black woman writer you know of. I mentioned Alice Walker's connection with her. When Alice Walker placed that marker on the grave in 1973, she wrote an essay about it that was published in Ms. Magazine in 1975. The essay was called Finding Zora. And that essay became instrumental in jump-starting the Hurston revival. All of her books came back into print, and a whole new generations, in fact, of writers discovered her. So for black women writers, other women of color writers, and, as I said earlier, writers of all colors and cultures have really embraced Zora as, a literary foremother. And so writers like Morrison, Walker, even some of the more popular younger writers like Tiare Jones, you know, they all just really recognize Hurston as a literary foremother. And her work is part of the canon now. 11th graders in AP English have to read Their Eyes Were Watching God. I just spoke to an 11th grade class maybe 3 weeks ago, and they were reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, and they were having trouble with the dialect, so I made them read some of it out loud, and we just had a great time. That's great. Yeah, but AP English students, 11th grade, that's where they're reading. If you have any 11th graders in your life, I bet they've read this book and have heard of it. So her impact has been huge.
This question is for Koki. I'd be very interested in reading a biography of your mother. Has one been written? That sounds very interesting.
My mother wrote a memoir before she went to the Vatican, after she left Congress. But as she said, think what a good book I could have written if I had been willing to tell the truth. So it's a lot glossed over. No. I don't want to write about anybody I know. My day job is doing that, and I get enough flack. I don't need it from the family as well. Over here.
So, in thinking about Zora Neale Hurston, I wonder what comparisons you'd make between her and Ralph Ellison.
So Ellison came several years later. You know, Hurston, the real, she didn't publish a book after 1948. And then Ellison was really a writer who came to prominence in the 1950s. And so he was rather dismissive of many of the writers who had come before him, many of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance, Zora's contemporaries like Langston Hughes. Hughes tried to befriend Ellison, but he was kind of dismissive, you know, sort of that slay the fathers sort of thing. And unfortunately, Ellison and Richard Wright, who came along in the 40s, were quite dismissive of Hurston because she wrote about the inner lives of women. You know, I mean, they felt like, Wright said about Hurston's novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, which, like I said, all 11th grade AP kids are reading. Richard Wright's criticism of that book was it carried no message, no theme, and no thought. Of course, Hurston, she could hold her on, so she later reviewed one of his books and talked about all the violence that was enough for any man, you know. So she definitely, responded to that. But I feel that the men were dismissive of her work because she was writing about the inner lives of self-educated women.
Valerie and I have a friend in common who is writing about the Harlem Renaissance, and we just keep piling other work on her, so she hasn't got a chance to do it. But that's going to be really fascinating when it comes out. It's Alelia Bundles, who is a good friend. Yeah,
Alelia wrote a biography of Madam C.J. Walker, who was her great-great-grandmother. And Madam Walker was one of the first black women millionaires. She had a hair care business, and now she's working on a biography of of Madam C.J. Walker's daughter, Alelia Walker, who was a great socialite and philanthropist during the Harlem Renaissance and was friends with Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, that whole community.
Over here.
Hi, thank you both very much. Koki,
Where are you?
I'm right here.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. You said you're writing a book about the Civil War. Is it going to be the women of the Civil War?
Yeah, it's going to be how the Civil War changed women's lives, focused on the political women in Washington. So, no. Yes, she is part of it. Yes.
This is for both of you. When you're talking to students, how do they respond to the material that they've read, either by Hurston or about the founding mothers?
Well, I've been talking to little kids, and they're fabulous. I mean, I've just so enjoyed doing it. I have grandchildren, 6 grandchildren who range in age between 8 and 13. So it's very much the same cohort. And they're a hoot. But I start by saying to them, you know, all those pictures, you know, of the Declaration and the Constitution and all that, is anything missing? And the little boys will just say something bizarre, you know. I mean, well, there's some symbol that you, what are you talking about, you know? And then finally some little girl will say, women, there are no women in any of the pictures. And so then I'll say, well, do you think there were any women then? Maybe there just weren't any women. And that gets them going, and that's really fun.
Yeah, as I said, I've been talking with 11th graders who are reading Their Eyes Were Watching God and some of Hurston's other work, and they're quite engaged by it. I mean, at heart, it's a love story, and they all have strong opinions about, you know, which man Janie should have ended up with and what she did to Logan before she left to, you know, run off a tea cake and that sort of thing. So they have strong opinions. But I have to agree with Koki, the younger kids are the best, because I've had a couple of occasions where I've talked with young kids and kind of talked about my process of writing the book, and they ask the best questions. Like when I talk about being, you know, at the Beinecke Library at Yale for a month working on the research, they'll say, they have asked me things like, well, who did you eat with? Were you lonely?
Yeah.
I mean, great kind of connection questions.
They are fascinated by the research.
Yeah.
They're very interested in the research.
Yes, I could ask this of both of you. Since you've been researching a lot about these founding mothers and pioneering women, whom do you think in the political stage today would be considered pioneering women, other than those obvious members or people that are in the news all the time? And if you could sort of give us some information about on both sides of
Other than the people who are the
well, we know who they are. We know who they are, and the names are obvious, familiar to all of us. If you could give us like a balance on both sides of the aisle, and both of you can no. Please.
Well, I'll just say one person whose biography I want to see in 30 years is Valerie Jarrett, because she knows where all the bodies are buried. You know, she's got that inside scoop, and she, of course, is, you know, at this point probably not willing to tell the truth. But it would be interesting in 25 years to kind of hear what it was like for her being on the inside of the Obama White House without the real glare of the spotlight. I mean, she could be sitting here today, and I don't know how many of us would like recognize her. She doesn't have the kind of spotlight, of course, that Michelle Obama has, but I think she's in an interesting position. So that's one person who comes to mind.
But there's nobody hidden, you know. Yeah. I mean, people who are in these roles are not hidden. So it's not like there's somebody you don't know about. You know about them. But something that you've just said, Valerie, really does strike me, though, which is, of course, because of independent prosecutors and all of that, a lot of records aren't being kept anymore in White Houses. And so we're not going to have the same, a biographer is not going to have the same material to rely on as was true, for instance, in a Roosevelt White House, you know, because people are afraid to write things down.
Also, Kogi, how do you feel about the fact that we are not writing letters anymore? Like, that was so important to us as biographers, but now people are going to have to go and hack your text mail, you know, your text account in order to write a biography about you.
But I do think that it's still better than it was. So there was that period in the late 70s through the 80s where it was all telephone. Mm-hmm. And so that's completely gone. Yeah. Whereas emails, you really can, and even tweet. I don't tweet, but even that gives you something. I mean, Steve and I wrote a book on marriage that had a chapter on pioneer marriages, and a woman who had moved to Oregon in the early 19th century knew that these women who moved west knew that they were doing something extraordinary, and so they kept diaries or they wrote letters that were sort of journalistic letters, and she wrote one saying, you know, was up at 5, baked 9 loaves of bread, taught my class, was delivered of a son. And And I feel that's a tweet. But you get the picture, and so I think we're better off than we were 20 years ago. Yeah. So, yeah. And along those lines, I advise hold on to your family's emails because you'll find that they really do tell a story. Particularly as people go off to college and get married and all of those things, they're all in there, all the florist stuff.
This question's for Cokie Roberts. My father was a big fan of yours when you were on Meet the Press. And several years ago, the book on marriage you had written From This Day Forward was very impactful and helpful to my sister. You love focusing on women in the colonial time. So with that book, a lot of your commentary was on marriage practices in colonial times, and then this recent book on founding women and part of the founding fathers. Can you comment on that? What are you fascinated about that time for women?
Well, I'm fascinated about that time for the country because it's when we became a country. And it's still true that our nationhood is basically an idea. We don't have common ethnicity, religion, even language, and our history, even though we have this short thing called American history, our histories are very different from each other around the country. So this period where the men and women came together and said, we're going to try this incredibly strange experiment and create a country based on consent is just so essential to understanding who we are as a people. And so it's the period of history that I find fascinating. I am now writing about the Civil War, which I don't find fascinating, partly because I'm from the South. But it's but the publishers are desperate for something on the Civil War, so I'm doing it. Okay. Well, thank you all so very, very much.